Father in heaven, we thank you for your presence among us. We ask, Lord, that you'll be with each and every one of us as we go through the sermon. We ask for your blessings in thy name. Amen. Tom sent me a text a couple of weeks ago and asked me if I had a sermon in my back pocket. And I had to admit that I didn't, but he asked if I would speak today, and I said, well, yes, of course, I'll do that. I did have ideas, though, already in my head, and I was thinking that I should sit down and start writing them, so I did. I didn't know what I wanted to speak about. And then her little whisper in my head, it said, what have you been speaking about? Maybe you should just continue it. So I thought about it. Last November when I spoke around Veterans Day, I talked about Daniel 2, and I talked about the toes of iron and clay. Well, then last month I was talking about Esther, and that was during the time of the breast of silver and breasts and arms of silver. And I thought, well, I'm talking about Daniel 2, so why don't I wasn't planning on doing a series, but maybe I should just go ahead. So I decided to do that. So during this time of Esther, that was the Medo-Persian Empire, what was happening to God's people at that time? Well, you remember that Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, and the books were brought to him, and they said, look, Cyrus, here's your name. It's prophesied that you will release the Jews and let us go back to Judea. Well, he struggled with it for a while, but he said, that's a good idea. I want you to take your things, I want you to take your people and go back and rebuild the temple. So they left, they got back, and they had all kinds of problems with the Samaritans. The temple started to get built, and then they quit, and they fought. And then one day it was brought up, this was during another king. His name was Cambyses. Then it was brought up to Darius the First, and then he sent some people over with some money to help build the temple. And then Artaxerxes the First comes along, and he sends Ezra over there. And Ezra takes more Jews back with him. In the same time period, Nehemiah goes back, takes some more people, takes some more of the temple goods. Malachi's there. He writes his book. And then no more prophets. There's no more prophets after Malachi. Now there's history, Jewish history goes on, but there's no biblical writings. That's about 445 BC when Malachi is written. Well, we're going to jump down to Darius the Third. He takes over as the king of Persia in 336. This is going to be the end of the silver. This week I want to introduce the belly and the thighs of brass, or bronze. Daniel 2:32 says, this is the third kingdom to rule the known world. And this is what Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar. There's a lesser kingdom, and an even lesser kingdom, and an even lesser kingdom. But this is the third one. I was just thinking about this, are my own thoughts about this image. It's interesting that the head is of gold. Gold is a mineral or a metal that doesn't corrode. If you go up to northeast Iowa and you pan for gold, you can find it, and it's there, but it's very tiny and it's yellow. It just like all it needs is a little polish to really make it shine, but it doesn't corrode. You can hammer it into shape. Very little gold can be hammered out into huge, very intricate detail. So, which is one of the reasons that people value it so highly. Then there's the arms and chest. They're of silver. Now silver, I don't know if you've ever looked for silver, but you can't pan for silver. Out in Virginia City, Nevada, they had this big gold strike, and they're digging for gold, and they're throwing all this black stuff away. They don't know what it is. It's piling up in these pilings. And one day, somebody was looking at it, and he tested it, he says, oh, well, if there isn't enough gold here to pay, we got to use this silver. All this silver, they had a huge silver strike. And they'd been throwing it away for years. And then you get down to the thighs and belly of bronze. Now, bronze is a conglomeration metal, an amalgamation. It's copper and tin. And the two metals together are much harder than separate. And when silver, it corrodes, it turns black. And if you have silver dishes and plates, you know that you got to polish them if you want them to stay shiny. Copper and bronze turns green as it corrodes, the color of the Statue of Liberty. Iron comes along and it can be worked into all kinds of metals and tools, and as the saying goes, beating our swords into plowshares. But it turns red with rust and literally disintegrates. So if you got toes made of iron and clay, if you built that statue and it's standing on there's these toes of iron and clay, and it gets rusty, the iron's going to rot out of it, the clay will wash away, and the statue's going to topple over, and the only thing that's going to remain after a time is the gold. They're just some random thoughts of my own. So Daniel 8, 20 and 22 talks about this power. Daniel has been wondering about this vision that he's had, and he's waiting for an explanation. And Gabriel says to him, the ram with two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. And the he-goat with one horn, kind of a unigoat type thing, is the king of Greece. Now, Media-Persia was two horns because it was two countries, Media and Persia, and one was stronger than the other, so it was a bigger horn. Now, you remember that during the story of Esther that I told you, Greece was not a powerful country. In fact, it wasn't a country at all. It was just a bunch of Greek cities. There's, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Delphi, Thebes, Pergamum, and they're all vying for power. They all have, they have other cities in other parts of the world. They're over in Italy, and they're in across the Aegean. But they're always fighting each other for power. And so they're never really strong, but they will band together. If somebody threatens another Greek city who's not a Greek, they'll band together. So they've beaten the Persians twice. Well, in the north part of modern Greece is Macedonia. Macedonia is a backwater. It's kind of like you'd say, no offense, Jim, those Kentucky and Tennessee hillbillies. And there's a king there named Philip, and he puts together an army and he says, I'm going to rule Greece. Now this is kind of like a bunch of hillbillies getting together, and what do? They go up and they invade New York, and they invade Boston and Washington, and integrate them into their own country. Well, Philip does this. He goes down, but the thing he does is different than everybody else. He founds more cities, he builds roads, he promotes farming, and he strives hard to win the hearts of the people. And he tries to enforce his rule without bloodshed. It doesn't always work, but he tries. Meanwhile, he has a son who's under the tutelage of Aristotle. Alexander is learning art, philosophy, religion, nature. He's a curious guy. He learns everything he can, and he's smart. He's really smart. In 338 BC, Thebes and Athens had risen up against his father, and Alexander is given the left-wing cavalry. 18 years old, leading this cavalry. Well, they attack, and he rides his cavalry in, and they encircle the invincible sacred band of Thebes. This is a legendary military group, and they will not surrender, and he has to kill them to the man. They all die. But now Philip is the ruler of all Greece. He calls a conference of all the cities at Corinth, and he lays down the law to the Greeks. No Greeks are going to make war on Greeks. Local governments would retain control over their areas, and the only tribute they would pay to Philip would be for soldiers and ships of the army. There was a proposal immediately that they should start a crusade into Asia Minor to free those Ionian Greek cities that were being held by the Persians. Well, Philip thinks that's a good idea, and he starts building an army. But one of his guards doesn't think the idea is so good and stabs him to death. Now, Alexander is the leader. Alexander moves north with his army, and he crushes some tribes up there that were being rebellious, and he extends the empire all the way to the Danube River, much farther than it ever was before. Then Thebes is causing problems again, so he heads south, and he crushes the uprising at Thebes, and he reinstates the Corinthian League. Alexander has said has never had a crisis of confidence. He always knew that he was the man of destiny. He knew that God was leading him. Now, the God, of course, that he was following lived on top of Mount Olympus, and he had to go to the oracles of Delphi to get blessings. But he had no qualms. He was confident. He knew what he was doing. So after he consolidates Greece, he heads across the Hellespont. The army goes up and around. He takes a ship over to Troy, and he goes to the grave of his hero, Achilles. Spends some time there, then rejoins his army. This guy, he's a man who's born to conquer. He's the son of a great warrior. He's nurtured on the tales of great warriors. He's taught by Aristotle, and he can quote Homer and Euripides and Pindar from memory. These are classic Greek writings. He's confident. He's the kind of guy who walks into a room and immediately owns the room. While campaigning, he would send botanical specimens back to Aristotle. He traveled along with geographers, astronomers, geologists, meteorologists, and artists. He was as much an explorer as he was a warrior. Remember in Daniel 2:39, Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar, "But after you shall rise another kingdom, it's inferior to yours, then a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth." Daniel 7, he's mentioned also. In Daniel 7:6, it says, "After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it." Then in Daniel 8:20, Gabriel's explaining the ram you saw having 2 horns. They are the kings of Media and Persia, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horns and the 4 that stand up after it, the 4 kingdoms shall rise out of that nation, but not with its power. These are all descriptions of the thighs and belly of bronze. Alexander rejoins his army, and at the Granicus River, he meets a Persian army of similar size, around 35 to 40,000 on both sides. They're on each side of the river. And Alexander, being a cavalryman, and he likes to lead from the front, he charges across the river, up the banks, and into the midst of the Persians. Well, it almost was the end of him. His helmet was split by a battle axe, and a spear bounced off his breastplate in the battle. But he survived, and the Persians retreated and ran. In the next few weeks, he just marches down the coast of Anatolia, capturing one city after another. Some of these are Greek cities, and they're not really all excited about him being there because they were doing well under the Persians. But he conquers them one after another, crosses the Tarsus Mountains. By this time, Darius III has raised an army of 300,000 men. He's got them arranged between the mountain and the sea, and he's just daring Alexander to attack. Alexander still 35 to 40,000 men. But Alexander knows now that he's jammed all those 300,000 men into a tight spot. They have no room to maneuver. And as the battle is joined, he's watching on his cavalry. They're moving back and forth, keeping an eye open, and there's the spot. There's a weak spot, and he charges right through it and heads right for Darius's camp. Darius is sitting on his throne watching the battle from the hillside, and he heads straight for him. Darius panics and flees. And as soon as the army sees that Darius has fled, so do they. So he continues his march south. He goes down to Tyre. Tyre is a city partially on land and partially on an island. Well, of course, the fort is on the island. So they abandoned the city, go to the island, and they said, "No way, Alexander, we're not surrendering. You can't get to us." So for the next few months, they tear down the city on land, and they throw it in the ocean, and they build a causeway. But even that doesn't work very well, because now his men are in a narrow spot. So he has to build a navy too, and it takes him 7 months. But he sent envoys into the city and asked them to surrender several times. And the city, they killed the envoys and threw their bodies off the walls. And that just enraged them. These guys come in under flag of truce, and you kill them. So when they finally broke into Tyre, it was bad. They pillaged the city. They sold 30,000 people into slavery. It wasn't the kind of thing he liked to do. Like his father, he liked to be generous with his captives. Next, he marches south into Egypt. And he's greeted there as a liberator, because they don't like the Persians. So they let him in. There's a big party. He spends about 6 months in Egypt. He goes out to the temples of Ammon, and they said that you don't have to worship Ammon because you are the god. And so he spends a few months there. He leaves, and he heads northwest. At this point, Darius sues for peace, and he says, "I'll give you 10,000 gold talents and my daughter for peace." And Alexander's general says, "Boy, that's good. You should take that." And he says, Alexander says, "If I were you, I would, but I'm me." And remember, Daniel 8:7 says, "And I saw him confront the ram. He moved against him with rage, attacking the ram and broke his 2 horns. And there was no power in the ram to withstand him. And he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could deliver the ram from his hand." So after he moved north, Darius meets him on another battlefield. Darius goes out there. He has that field plowed and smooth, and it's ready. When they get here, we're going to, we'll fight him on this prepared field. He's got these chariots, and you've seen them in movies, I'm sure, with the big blades out on the wheels so that they can just chop up anything and everybody. He's got 50 of these. Well, they're all lined up on the field. Alexander and his cavalry, they start moving off at an angle and not engaging in the fight. And Darius falls for his ruse, and he starts sending guys out. You better keep an eye on him. So Alexander keeps them going. He walks them right out in so that they're out of the prepared battlefield. They're stumbling around in the rocks and the brush. And the chariots, Darius sends them in. So these 50 chariots come charging toward this phalanx of Greeks, and they wait till the chariots are right there, and then everybody steps out, and they leave lanes, and all the chariots go right through, and the cavalrymen in the rear take care of the chariot guys. Hardly lost a man. When they do this, it leaves a weak spot in the Persian lines, and that cavalry spins around and crashes right through that weak spot and heads right for Darius again. And Darius again flees. This time he flees all the way back to Media, which is clear up in the Persian highlands. After that, Alexander marches through town after town, satrap after satrap. They just throw open the doors of the city. He says, "Come on in." He gets to Babylon. They throw open the gates, and they start a festival that lasts for a month. Susa capitulates. Then he gets to Persepolis. Persepolis tried to put up a feeble fight, but he overran them quickly. Persepolis is where the Persian Empire kept their monies. All their treasures were there. So he captured the Persian treasury. It took 2,000 pairs of mules and 500 camels to remove all the treasure. Then Alexander takes a small side trip. He goes out to the tomb of another one of his heroes, Cyrus the Great. He goes out to his tomb. He goes in the tomb, and he meditates in there for several hours, it said. And then he came out, and he says, okay, this place needs a bunch of updates and repairs. Get it done. Cyrus was one of his heroes. He goes back to Persepolis. Well, because the people at Persepolis had put up a little fight and there'd been some other little problems, they had a big drunken party one night, and somebody started throwing torches around, and they burned the city down. Even today, if you could get to Iran and go there, you'd find that it's a beautiful place. The carvings there's steps that go up to where the palace was, and on the sides there are carvings of each group of people who came, and you can find the Hebrews on there by their headgear. I've seen so many pictures. I'd love to go there, but I don't think it's worth getting killed for. By this time, Alexander had become to realize that he was not just a king of the Greeks. He had realized he now ruled an empire. In 4 years, he'd conquered half the Persian Empire. And he started to adopt some of the Persian. He started wearing Persian clothes, some of their kingly things going on, and his people didn't like it much. They wanted to be Greeks. They didn't want to be Persians. But he had more Persian subjects than he did Greeks now. It would take another 8 years for him to subdue the rest of the Persian Empire. And he would nearly catch Darius up by the Caspian Sea, way far to the north, in what's today Russia. Then Darius was murdered by his own men. Alexander went after the killer and found him, had him flogged, and then turned him over to Persian courts. He moved through Afghanistan, subduing those tribes, the same tribes that you're fighting today. He moved all the way north to Samarkand. Then he went south into the Indus Valley. And in India, he had several big battles. He went a couple hundred miles into India, but then his soldiers said, we've been fighting for 12 years. We want to go home. We're not going any farther. So Alexander went into his tent. He spent 3 days in there. You don't know what he did, moping, whatever, but he came out. He says, okay, we're going home. So he divides his army up into 3 groups. One group goes by sea. One group goes across the desert, one goes through the mountains. And they're all going back to Babylon. They'll meet there. Alexander, he leads the group that goes across the desert, and he almost doesn't make it. They really lost a lot of men on the way across the desert. They made it back to Babylon in 325. And he stays there for about 2 years, consolidating things. He's building more towns. He's administrative duties. He's building schools. He's bringing teachers from Greece out there to teach, and he's sending people from Persia back to Greece, and he's spreading the Hellenist influence throughout the world. One day he's out along an irrigation ditch supervising, which seems a weird thing for him to do, but he was interested in these things. And he gets bit by a mosquito. This mosquito probably had malaria. And the fever took its toll and forced him to his bed. And in a few days, he was dead. He was only 32 years old. In 13 years, Alexander went from a backward king's son to the ruler of the largest empire known at that time. From Greece to the Indus River, from Egypt to the Danube, he pulled a vast tide of humanity along with behind him. Traders, administrators, teachers, soldiers. But almost as soon as he died, the empire began to fragment. Generals fought over the spoils. Ptolemy ended up in Egypt. Macedonia went to Antigones. Another northern part went to the Seleucids. The Greek states, they turned right around and started fighting each other again, went right back to it. And Macedonia turned back into the backwater that it had been before. Now the prophecies of Daniel will tell you what happened in that time period, because eventually it became just two kings, the king of the north and the south. So I come to the end of the story of Alexander, and it's, what does Alexander have to do with us anyway? Well, number one, Alexander confirms the prophecies of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar was given this dream, told how it would work, and just the way the dream went or the prophecies went, that's how it happened. It confirms the prophecies. So we can trust them also. All the books written in the New Testament and quite a few of the Old Testament were written in Greek. If you walk outside, go across the driveway and turn around and look at our church, you'll see a mixture of both Greek and Roman architecture. You see, the Romans, they copied the Greeks. If the city or town that you live in, or for that matter, even the road you live in out in the country, is established on a grid pattern, well, that's Greek. That was their system of order. Most state and federal buildings that you look at copy Greek architecture. If you take a look at paintings of Alexander and then take a look at paintings of Jesus, you can see the resemblance. Because nobody knows what Jesus looked like, so he was a conqueror, so he must have been like Alexander. Every army on earth today studies the tactics of Alexander. But by 200 BC, there wasn't much left of Alexander's empire. In the west, a new upstart was stretching out, an iron empire. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you that you care so much about us, that you would give dreams to people to interpret so that we can understand what's happening. We know that you love us, that you will strengthen us and guide us in our days ahead. We ask for your blessings in thy name. Amen.